Part 3, Chapter 5. Little Alf Cheetham was on watch, and he dashed among the tents. "Crack," he shouted. "Crack, lash up and stow." Within seconds, all hands had tumbled out of their tents. They saw two cracks, one running the length of the floe, and another extending at right angles to the first. In addition, the whole pack was rising to a very marked swell. They ran to the James Caird and wrenched the frozen runners of her sledge free of the ice, then manhandled her to the center of the floe. By then, the crack down the center had widened out to about 20 feet in some places, and could be seen slowly working back and forth under the influence of the swell. Their store of meat was on the other side. Several men jumped across where the crack was, not so wide, and pitched the meat over the seam of open water. By 6:45, everything was safely across, and work was halted for breakfast. The men were standing around, waiting for their ration, when the floe cracked again, this time directly under the James Caird, 100 feet from their tents. No order was needed. The men dashed to the boat and quickly brought her up closer to the tent area. Finally, they were able to eat breakfast. Their usual lump of dog pemmican, 6 pieces of sugar, and a half mug of milk. Breakfast was hardly finished when through the mists, a strange shape appeared, moving deliberately across a nearby section of their old floe. Wild ran to get his rifle from his tent, then he dropped to one knee and shot. The animal bucked and slowly sank down onto the ice. Several men hurried to where it lay, a sea leopard nearly 11 feet long. With one bullet, it seemed, Wild had changed the whole complexion of their lives. There at their feet lay nearly 1,000 pounds of meat and at least 2 weeks' supply of blubber. Shackleton announced that they would feast on the sea leopard's liver for lunch. In high good spirits, the party sent out the dogs to return the trophy to camp. When it was butchered, they found it in its stomach nearly 50 undigested fish, which were carefully set aside to be eaten the next day. It was 9 o'clock by the time the job was finished. Shackleton then summoned Macklin and told him the time had come to shoot his dogs. Macklin made no protest, for there was really no longer any reason to spare them. The possibility of reaching Ocean Camp was more remote than ever in view of the new breakup, and now that they had the sea leopard, the need for risking such a trip was past. Accomplished by Wild, Macklin drove his team across the narrow neck of a crack to where the galley formerly had stood. On the way, they passed what had been the meat dump. Songster, a wild old dog, grabbed up a discarded penguin head, and Boston got hold of a bone. They were both allowed to keep them. Macklin was almost sick as he unharnessed one dog at a time and took it around the protective mound of ice. Wild, as before, sat each dog down in the snow, placed the muzzle of the revolver against its head, and pulled the trigger. Songster died with the penguin head in his mouth, and Boston died gripping his bone. When all the dogs had been killed, Macklin skinned and gutted the carcasses, preparing them for eating. Crean's team of puppies was also killed and butchered. Back at camp, there was almost a holiday atmosphere in anticipation of the first hot lunch in more than 2 weeks. The suggestion was made that they sample the dog meat, and Shackleton agreed. Crean cut small steaks from his dog, Nelson, and Macklin did the same with Gruss. When the meat had been fried, Crean hurried around to distribute it. He went first to Shackleton's tent, poking his weathered Irish face through the flap. "I've just brought a bit of Nelson for you to try," he said puckishly. The meat of the dogs was universally acclaimed. "Their flesh tastes a treat," McNeish remarked. "It is a big treat to us after being so long on seal meat. James found it surprisingly good and tasty." Worsley said that the piece of Gruss he ate has a better flavor than the sea leopard, and Hurley went so far as to say it was exquisitely tender and flavorous, especially Nelson, which equaled veal. Throughout the morning, the swell had continued and even increased slightly. So at lunch, Shackleton announced that they would immediately go on a watch and watch system, 4 hours on and 4 hours off. Shackleton would take charge of one watch and Wild the other. Thus, half the party would be on duty at all times, fully dressed with their gear lashed and ready to move at a moment's notice. 2 of the men on watch would be required to walk the floe continuously, looking for cracks or any other threatened emergency. The others would be permitted to stand by in their tents. During the day, there were more and more signs of imminent opening. Cape pigeons and terns could be seen overhead, and Worsley sighted a magnificent giant petrel, snow white, except for 2 bands of black across its wings, a definite sign of open water. Clark spied a jellyfish in the crack between two floes and stated flatly that such creatures were found only in the vicinity of ice-free seas. These, plus a black water sky to the northwest, the presence of the swell, and a high temperature of 34 degrees, led Worsley to remark, "It certainly looks promising," but then he added, "Hope tells a flattering tale." Toward 3 p.m., the weather turned showery, and by 8 o'clock, when Wild's watch took over, it was raining steadily. Wild and McElroy moved into number 5 tent for the period of the watch, and in spite of the miserably crowded, wet conditions, there was a cozy atmosphere. Everyone delighted in listening to some new stories instead of the oft-repeated tales from the same wearisome tent mates. Soon after the arrival of the newcomers, the men were permitted the luxury of a match. "Are you ready?" Wild asked as the smokers waited with their pipes and cigarettes. Then the precious match was struck, casting its glare on the circle of bearded faces. Individual tapers of terry, rope yarn were lighted from the match. Then everyone settled back, puffing contently. Wild launched into a series of stories about his past escapades involving ladies, and McElroy lived up to his reputation as the most cosmopolitan member of the expedition by explaining to an attractive audience his recipe for mixing several cocktails, including one guaranteed aphrodisiac called the Bosom Caresser. Otherwise, the night passed uneventfully. By dawn, the rain had ceased and the wind had shifted to the south, blowing cold and dry. The swell gradually subsided. In spite of all the encouraging signs, the packs showed little change throughout the day and into the next morning. In the afternoon, a very dark water sky appeared from the southwest, stretching all the way around to the northeast. But in view of the southerly wind, a sudden opening seemed unlikely. So Shackleton deemed it safe to cancel the sea watches, but one-man patrols were continued day and night. That evening, just at 8 o'clock as Macklin was relieving orderlies on watch outside, the floe unexpectedly rose to a swell and cracked, hardly 2 feet from Wild's tent. Macklin and orderlies both spread the alarm, but everybody had turned in, confident that there would be no breakup, and the emergency caught them almost totally unprepared. There was a great scramble to get dressed in the pitch black tents, with everyone trying to find the right clothes and attempting to get into boots that had frozen in the 20-degree cold. Even after the men were out of their tents, there was confusion about exactly what was the trouble and where the danger was. They groped their way around in the dark, bumping into one another and stumbling into unseen holes in the ice. But order was finally restored. The boats were moved closer to the tents, and the stocks of meat, which again had been cut off by the crack, was pitched across in the darkness. Shackleton ordered sea watches resumed, and that the off-duty men turn in all standing, fully dressed, including mittens and helmets. It was hard to sleep. Throughout the night, the floe lifted very noticeably to the heavy swell, perhaps a foot or more, and then repeated shocks as it bumped against other floes were disconcerting. They all knew that the floe was now so small that should it crack again, something or somebody would almost inevitably fall through and probably be crushed. But when morning came, the southerly wind dropped, and during the forenoon, the swell disappeared. At noon, for the first time in 6 days, Worsley obtained a sight. It put their position at 62 degrees 33 minutes south, 53 degrees 37 minutes west. They had drifted an astonishing 28 miles north in 6 days, and this is in spite of 5 days of adversely northerly winds. The pack was obviously under the influence of a northerly current. It was April 3rd, McLeod's 49th birthday. The party had just toasted his health at lunch when a sea leopard's head appeared at the edge of the floe. McLeod, who was a small but stocky man, went over and stood flapping his arms to imitate a penguin. The sea leopard apparently was convinced, for he sprang out of the water at McLeod, who turned and dashed for safety. The sea leopard humped forward once or twice, then stopped, apparently to take stock of the other strange creatures on the floe. The delay was fatal. Wild had reached into his tent for his rifle, he took deliberate aim and fired, and another 1,000 pounds of meat was added to their larder. Thus, the store of provisions was growing steadily. As it did, and the rations were increased, the morale of the whole party improved accordingly. The gloomy, morose grumblings of a few days before, when they had faced the prospects of eating putrid seal meat raw, vanished, and occasionally their attention even turned to matters outside the sphere of simple survival. The afternoon of McLeod's birthday, Worsley and Rickinson launched into a long, noisy argument on the seemingly remote subject of the relative cleanliness of New Zealand, versus English dairy farms. Though everyone was fully aware that their situation was becoming more critical by the hour, it was much easier to face danger on a reasonably full stomach. Their floe, which had once measured a mile in diameter, was now less than 200 yards across. Most of the time it was surrounded by open water, and it was constantly menaced by swells and collisions with other floes. Clarence Island lay 68 miles due north of them, and though they had appeared to be making toward it, they were concerned with the gradual westerly set of their drift, which threatened to increase. If it did, they would be swept out to sea through Loper Channel, the 80-mile-wide gulf between Elephant Island and King George Island. It would be hard, wrote McNeish, after drifting into those straits and then be blown out to sea. And James noted, a great air of expectancy everywhere. We are on the verge of something. There is no doubt. If all goes well, we may be on land very soon. Our chief need is an opening in the ice. Our chief danger, being carried beyond these islands in close pack. Our mark, Clarence and Elephant Islands. It was impossible to obtain a sight the following day, which was damp and misty, with an unpleasantly heavy smell running. However, on April 5th, Worsley obtained a position, and it showed that they were headed straight for the open sea.